Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Today we're sitting down with a brand new guest. His name is Edward Dodge. He has written a book that is going to absolutely blow your mind. It's called A History of the Goddess from the Ice Age to the Bible. And I kid you not, every page of this book has something on it I did not know. And so you have to pick it up, add it to your library. But he's here today to tell us a little bit about it, a little bit about his journey. So Ed, welcome to the show. I appreciate you and your amazing work.
Well, thanks, Glenn. Thanks for the kind words. I really appreciate it. And I'm really, as I was saying offline, I'm really glad to have a chance to talk to you here. And I picked up on your show recently and your efforts recently, and I'm really eager to talk to you guys and your whole your crowd here.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So as much as I want to dive into your book, because there's just so much here. I mean, this book it's not a short book. There's a ton of information here, and we can barely do it justice in our time together, but we'll see what we can do. But before we get into that, I'd love to hear a little bit about your story, because in our email exchange, you shared a little bit about how your faith has evolved over the years. So maybe talk to us about kind of where you were in the past and where you are today, and a little bit of the ups and downs and high points of the journey that got you from there to here.
So I mean, this is a good way to get into the book. So I was saying to you in the emails, Glenn, that you and I have had a very different journey, but we've kind of come to some similar places. My high school years were not like yours. I grew up going to church. I grew up in Washington, D.C.
Mm-hmm.
My father was in the government. I grew up around a lot of government stuff. It's kind of like, if I were to go into my whole childhood background, that's kind of a big deal from a lot of government.
Was he like doing stuff in the government that nobody is allowed to talk about? That kind of
no.
stuff?
He was no, it was quite the opposite. So my whole thing was that I grew up very near like the power in DC, but we weren't of the power.
Gotcha.
So my dad was a senior guy in the bureaucracy, but he worked at Housing and Urban Development. So he was like one of the lead guys at HUD, which is like not as sexy and cool as being a lead guy at the State Department or the White House, which were our like neighbors and peers. We knew these other people, my friends. I grew up around a lot of politicians' kids, some of them famous. So like I grew up around all these folks that were like, my friend's dad is really powerful, but my dad is like not that powerful.
Gotcha.
Kind of like if you grew up in Hollywood and your dad worked on the movie sets as like the editor or like the cameraman, and you would interact with these famous people, but you were clearly not one of them.
Right. You rubbed elbows.
Exactly. I rubbed elbows. We saw people in passing on the street.
Gotcha.
Anyway, but I mean, I was a little closer to it than that, but nonetheless. So I grew up in Washington, D.C. But and so I grew up in a Presbyterian church, and I went to church regularly, but my parents were not super religious, and we were most definitely not evangelicals. We were mainline Presbyterians, and we did not read the Bible literally. I was actually quite appreciative of like the upbringing I had, which was to not be hung up on any of these stories being literally true, but mind them for their moral teachings and what the wisdom is that you can try and unearth behind it, because that's how I was taught to read the Bible in Sunday school as a kid. And I gotta be honest, Ben. We were taught in Sunday school that the evangelicals were doing it wrong. Like that's not the right way to read the Bible. We called you all Bible thumpers, and but those kinds of churches, the ones I went to, are exactly the ones that are dying now. That everyone has been leaving because they're not that grounded in any kind of firm faith. They were quite liberal, borderline secular even. And those are the churches that people have been abandoning now. And those mainline churches are the ones that have been losing congregations, while the evangelicals people have been either, my theory, people are either leaving the church or doubling down on it. So the evangelical churches are growing. Those old mainline churches are all like the ones I grew up in have been totally fading. But then as it turned out, I ended up going to a Catholic high school in DC called Gonzaga. And so for those, it was 3 years, 10th, 11th, 12th grade, I was getting church 6 days a week. And the Catholics were very different than the Presbyterians, and their whole approach to the Bible and theology pretty much knocked me out of my chair, because it wasn't like, here kid, read this, tell me what you think. It was, don't read it, I'm going to tell you what to think, and you repeat after me. That was how I was taught in Catholic high school, which just like, it totally floored me. And then when we did a whole proof of the resurrection, like a whole apologetics thing when I was a senior, that they were going to lay down like the Catholic Church's evidence for why their authority is true. And I remember thinking like, that's all you got? Like, that's it? That's all the evidence? Like, there's nothing outside the Bible, and the stuff in the Bible is paper thin to be generous.
Yeah.
And I couldn't square personally the claims of authority with all the injustice that the church wielded all over the world, and how they would condemn entire people groups simply because they didn't believe in Jesus, like entire other cultures.
Yeah.
I just couldn't square that. And I was never really down with atonement. I never understood why Jesus.
Yes.
Like as a kid,
Preach,
I was like,
preach.
I don't like that. I don't buy it. Like, how did Jesus die for my sins 2,000 years ago? This doesn't make any sense at all. I had other questions as a kid in church. I was like, where's the mother? And we're gonna come back to this. Why is it Father, Son, and Holy Ghost? Why is there no mother, father, son? I asked this question as a child. The other question I asked, which we'll also come back to, is what were those Canaanites doing anyway? Like, they're doing all this terrible, horrible, evil stuff. I'm like, I'm quite curious. Like, that sounds kind of intriguing. Because I never really explained it,
Yeah. Just go in there and kill them all. That's all.
Yeah, exactly. Like, what were they doing? Like, okay.
Yeah.
So anyway, in high school, I was kind of in the Grateful Dead crowd, smoking weed, doing psychedelics, and I'd gone down that path at a pretty young age. And so, and this actually is going to get into the this sort of actually set the stage for my politics, because it was when I was like in high school, I learned about cannabis, that it's both marijuana and hemp fibers. And no one ever taught us this about hemp, that it's also this most important fiber that was the backbone of the US Navy, that was needed for every ship that's ever been sailed, and that our founding fathers were growing the heck out of it. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson couldn't get enough of it. They were growing crops, writing about it, and all the founding fathers, US Navy, couldn't get enough of cannabis sativa hemp because they needed it to build ships. And I was like, wait a minute, like, you're lying to me about George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. Like, why are you guys lying to me? This was when I was a teenager, and growing up in DC, growing up very close to George Washington grew up, actually. Like, I'm right near Mount Vernon. I grew up in Northern Virginia. So I was like, why are you guys lying to me about all this stuff? And this, I was like, I know you were lying about Vietnam and lying about racism stuff, but like, you're lying about this stuff too, just so you can arrest us. And so that kind of set me on this journey of being very curious about this whole story of trying to figure out why do they hate marijuana when they embrace alcohol and tobacco? Like, that was the other part of the question. It's like, why is our society going to arrest us in the most brutal way for this plant that doesn't kill anybody? Like, literally zero deaths for marijuana in thousands and thousands of years. No deaths. Say what you want about it being harmful. Nobody dies ever. No diseases, no death. And yet they'll throw you in jail for it. And they're going to lie to us about the hemp fiber thing, which like doesn't even make any sense at all. Like, why are you lying to me? And so when I was in college, I went to Cornell University as an undergrad, and was actually there for big part of my life. I was at Cornell. I got kicked out. I was kind of a rebellious student. I got kicked out as an undergrad. And so I wanted to write, I learned all the hemp stuff from this book called The Emperor Wears No Clothes. It's kind of the underground cult classic in the hemp world. But that book was written as like a collage. It was like all these like photocopied articles all stuck together. It's not a narrative. And so what I wanted to do was turn that book into a narrative. And I was like going to write this history of hemp during this year that I was kicked out of college, because I still had my library passes and everything. I could still use the libraries at Cornell. And Cornell's this big ag school, so it has the most amazing agricultural libraries outside the USDA. So I could use The Emperor Wears No Clothes and go into the stacks and find all these old vintage books from like the 1800s talking about hemp. And so I got into this story, and there's this whole religious side of it because it's spiritual in India. I realized I was writing a history of the world from multiple cultures, like the entire history of China from the Neolithic, the entire history of Europe from the Neolithic, history of like the Middle East. So, wow, I can't write this at age 20. This is like,
you're deep in a rabbit hole now.
So anyway, life went on. I bagged that project. I worked on it for a year, quite diligently though, and then I went back to school and I graduated. And then I ended up having a kid pretty young. So I was like, all right, well, all this crazy left-wing radical stuff, I got to drop that and get a real job, because I can't make a living at doing that. So I got into computers and I've had a tech career my entire career. Like, I work in solar power these days. And so, but that project, what it did was it gave me this key about this thread of history all the way through but by following the plant, I had this thread of history it's an unbroken chain of history, because both the drugs and the fiber are being used in a consistent manner all the way through history. So the stuff you see in today's culture with sex, drugs, and rock and roll actually permeates back all the way through history, because people have been, the association with cannabis and sex and spirituality of it actually permeates all the way through, and the association with music and dance permeates all the way through history. So you can find this in an unbroken chain of events. Like you can just, wherever the plant is, you can find the people doing the same stuff. And so 20 years later, 25 years later, I hadn't looked at any of that stuff again, but I was actually, I had a whole tech career, as I was saying. I work in renewable energy. I went and worked in the weed business for 2 years, 3 years. When weed was getting legal in California, I went out there, and it was a complete like fiasco business wise. Like the entire California marijuana business is a total disaster. And so everybody's going bankrupt, and I was like, got basically black-eyed myself. And I was living out there though, and I was pretty much, I'd reached a point where I was totally fed up and I'd quit. But I was living on the beach in Humboldt County, California, where the redwoods come down to the coast, and it's incredibly beautiful. And that's where the legendary cannabis grows are. That's when I decided to write this book. I wanted to revitalize my cannabis history book, but I was looking for a new project. And I knew about this stuff in the Bible. I knew that from other people's research, Chris Bennett in particular, that there's these 5 references to marijuana that have been mistranslated in the Old Testament. And the most important reference is that it's an ingredient in Moses' holy anointing oil. So the word is canna or cannabism. It's used 5 times, but it gets mistranslated as either aromatic cane or calamus, which is a different plant. But those translations don't actually make sense in the context. And scholars have long recognized, like Christian scholars have long recognized, that these 5 verses are ambiguous, and they don't really know what the plant is. And so, but being an ingredient in Moses' holy anointing oil is actually really has profound theological implications, because the holy anointing oil anoints all of the sacred items in the tent of the tabernacle, and in the Holy of Holies, and in the first temple, and the Ark of the Covenant, and the priests, and kings, King David. You know, Jesus Christ is the anointed one. Christ means the anointed one. It's all about this stuff. So it's like there's these really significant theological implications if that is in fact actually marijuana in that recipe. Like you have to just, no matter your politics, like that's the scholarship. Like and I've been trying to get real scholars to like pay some attention to this. Me and Chris Bennett have been like trying to get people to pay attention to this. Like, at least give us a reading. Like, is this scholarship legit or not? Tell us, give us the thumbs up or thumbs down that these 5 verses are or not marijuana, because the other verses are that it's being burnt as a temple offering, and that it's in the Song of Songs, and it's listed as a trade good from Tyre, from Lebanon. But there's like really theological implications to it. So when I got into this book, my thesis was that, all right, it's there at the time of Moses, and at some point later it gets kicked out, because it's clearly not part of Jewish traditions later on, right? So at some point it got thrown out. And that's what I wanted to figure out, and that's what I wanted to write a book about. And that's when I started to discover the whole thing about Asherah and the wife of God in the Old Testament, which I had never heard anything about ever. All my years church. And I don't know if you've seen these books, but Did God Have a Wife by Weaver, he's a modern day archaeologist. But Raphael Patai was the first one to do it back in the 60s, and he's a Jewish scholar. This book came out in 1967, and was totally ignored at the time. But he's pointing out that basically they're polytheistic still in the first temple, and that they hadn't achieved the monotheism God of the Bible. Because I remember as a kid asking, what was the difference between the first temple and the second temple? And my Sunday school teacher, I mean, what were you taught about first temple versus second temple?
I mean, the second temple was more or less identical. I mean, that's what
exactly.
I was taught,
that's
right?
what I was taught too. That they were more or less the same. That
they just rebuilt it,
like,
and we had a couple advances here and there, but pretty much the same.
Exactly. That's exactly what I was taught too. But now what all the scholarship reveals is that is entirely not true. That is exactly 100% not true at all. That the first temple, they're still totally pagan. They are 100% polytheistic. There is no monotheistic God of the Bible at all. That there's an entire pantheon of gods, and it's the Canaanite gods. And they've only been discovered in the last century who they were, and what the pantheon was, and how the structure works. And the way I see it is it's very parallel, that all the Indo-European traditions follow a common pattern. So from Mesopotamia, so from Sumer, through all the Mesopotamian traditions, the Canaanites, the Greeks, and the Romans all have a common pattern to their pantheon, and we can map this through. The academics hate this model because they like to deconstruct. So they don't want to say that these two gods are the same, but they are. And so in the first temple, so first of all, the God of the Bible is originally two separate gods. It's El and Yahweh. El is the very ancient Heavenly Father, who's the Heavenly Father across the entire ancient Near East. The Greeks call him Kronos. He's the father of the Olympian gods for their tradition, but he's called Anu or On for the Mesopotamians, and he's also called El. And then they say he's got 70 sons, and it's his sons that are the local rulers of every place. So you got this father-son co-regency relationship that all the people recognize that the one Heavenly Father is just one heaven. There's just one Heavenly Father for everybody. Everybody recognizes this, and it's the same Heavenly Father we have now, because it's just a 50,000 year conversation we've been having. So the traditions just spiral forward, and so it's the same Heavenly Father, but it's his son. If you live in Babylon, his son Baal is your king of the gods. But if you live over in Baal was the king of the gods for the Canaanites. Over in Babylon, it's Marduk. In Assyria, it's Ashur. It was Enlil for the farther back for the Sumerians. They've all got, and then it's Jupiter and Zeus. It's all the same. It's the same pattern. So for Yahweh, when he comes along, he is a new god, a young god. Baal had been the king of the gods for a long time, all the way through the second millennium BC. For the Canaanites, when Yahweh comes along, he's just another god in the pantheon, and Baal is the king of the gods. And so these guys stage a revolution, the followers of Yahweh. And I believe it's a cultural war first, and then it becomes a theological thing. But that basically they're fighting about this stuff over the whole First Temple period. I do believe the First Temple is dedicated to Yahweh in Jerusalem. I do believe there was a real First Temple, a Phoenician style temple. I do believe, I don't know about a United Kingdom, but I do think that King David and King Solomon were there. That King David did take Jerusalem in 1000 BC. What's like 1004 or 1006 is the year. Like that's a historical event, and that we can go through the Book of Kings basically, First and Second Kings, and that's all history. Like it's propaganda. It's a propaganda version of the history, but that all those peoples and events are all actually happened. Is kind of my thesis. And so in the First Temple, they're fighting with Baal and they're fighting with Asherah. The question is why? Why are they trying to get rid of Baal, and why are they trying to get rid of Asherah? And I think in Exodus happened too, by the way. But it not as theological. That it was an actual slave revolt that happened that triggered some of these events, but that the theology stuff all comes later. So they're fighting with Baal and they're fighting with Asherah. The question is why? So Baal, I think, is actually not that hard. It's a child sacrifice tradition, first of all. Like they really were doing these ugly Molech sacrifices. The ones that we say that the tradition said that they were sacrificed to the god named Moloch. Modern scholars think that's been mistranslated, and that it should just be called Mulk, M-U-L-K, and that that's just the name for a type of sacrifice. There is no god Moloch, but this was the name for a specific ritual where you sacrifice your baby. And that this was being done in the cultures of Baal all the way out to Carthage, because the Phoenicians worship Baal. So they had Baal worship all the way all around the Mediterranean. So the Carthaginians that fought with the Romans later on, they were Baal worshipers, like Hannibal, the general who attacked Rome later on.
Yeah.
Hannibal, his name is Baal. He's got Baal in his name. They're Baal worshipers. And they were doing these ugly child sacrifices, and the Greeks and Romans were writing about it with all the same level of disgust that the Hebrew prophets had for it, because they also thought it was disgusting.
Yeah.
And so I think that's part of it. And then secondly, let's talk about the goddesses, because this is where things get interesting, because the scholars are totally downplaying the significance of Asherah and what's going on here, and are actually really, really, really missing it.
All I was taught in seminary was Asherah was just the goddess of fertility, and that's pretty much, and they just did away with her because she was pagan and evil. And that was it. Knock down the Asherah poles because Yahweh doesn't like that, because Yahweh's number one. And that's all I was taught. That was the extent.
And that's not actually inaccurate. That's not wrong. It's just totally wildly incomplete.
Right. That was the only piece I was given.
to be complete, first of all, you would say that she is the Israelite mother goddess.
Mm-hmm.
So let's start there. She's the mother goddess, and there's a divorce. She's the wife of El, right? And so Yahweh is one of her children. And so, and the mother and the father are like sort of the core of like, they're the parents of all the gods. And so there's always been a mother goddess. So I come from.
That's wild. Yeah, it's wild because I was never taught that, but that could keep going.
Yeah,
that's what blew my mind in the book was that. Yeah,
right. So like that's what blew my mind too, was that first of all, when I learned about the wife of God as a concept, like it just hurt my brain. Like I couldn't like rock. Like, what do you mean God's got a wife? Like there's no theological space for that. I don't know how to like put that square peg into this round hole because it's so opposite of anything I've ever been taught and challenges my entire cosmological worldview of how I understand the Christian God. Like it just literally doesn't make sense, and I can't make it make sense unless I completely reconfigure my notion of God. And so what I went down this path of just trying to figure out what Asherah was. So my first question was, okay, so secondly, I want to back up and say, my mind was blown by how uninterested the academics were in the subject. Like they were perfectly content to say, God's got a wife, you religious people are dumb, and like that's all we got to say about it. Like, and like that's like they're not interested at a theological level, because I was like, I want to understand theologically how God can have a wife. This doesn't make sense. And so as I started digging into it, because my first question I had was like, if you followed Asherah, what did you believe in? If you were a follower of Asherah, what were your beliefs, and what were your practices? What were your rituals? And so as I started getting into it, they started talking about all this sex stuff and this music stuff. And then I started to make the association that these are common traditions, that the tradition of Asherah is not unique, that all of these goddess religions all across the Near East are sharing a common set of traditions. And as I'm writing my book, everything I wrote in my book, I was learning it as I was writing it. I started out writing a history of cannabis and ended up writing a history of the goddess. And every single chapter was something I learned as I wrote it. And I was like, oh my God, that's incredible. And I wrote this chapter, and then I learned something new, and I wrote another chapter, and then I learned something new. I was like, oh my God, I should have put that 3 chapters ago. And then I was still writing, and I'd gotten a publisher. And then finally my publisher was like, time's up. You got to give me what you have today. And it was like college, like turn down your pen. And so the book was never really properly vetted. It was never properly edited. It was never properly like, it was my personal exploration as I was writing it. I think it turned out pretty good, and I'm proud of it, but there's definitely errors that I would correct on the margins for sure. And also I'm very keen. I knew from the start I needed to do a follow-up book that would like be more scholarly, that was more cohesive. So I'm slowly working on that now. But what I really the conclusion I've come to is that, so I come from the Maria Gimbutas school. She's a famous archaeologist who is kind of controversial. She's dead now, but she pioneered this idea that the original religion of all of Eurasia is Mother Goddess, and that we have these matriarchal tribal cultures that predate civilization. And this became a very popular theme in feminist history. Gimbutas died in the 90s. She was like doing this work from like the 50s until the 90s, and all this pioneering archaeology. It was controversial, but she had her following and her champions. But after she died in the 90s, all of academia kind of took this whole turn where they decided that they're going to deconstruct all of these narratives. That there's no matriarchies, there's no sex rituals, there's no mother goddess, there's none of this stuff. It's all BS. Everything's BS. Deconstruct, 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 deconstruct. And I think that, get beyond Robert Graves. Robert Graves is a famous writer back in the 40s who wrote about this stuff too, because these ideas have been developing for like a century or so. I am not the first person to write this stuff down. And so, but the academics just went in a completely different direction, decided it's all BS. And so like, I can't get anyone to like engage with me from an academic perspective, because I'm trying to reconstruct these narratives. I'm trying to put those narratives back together. And I think that they're robbing the story of they're taking the story out of it, right? They're just reconstructing down to a pile of pieces, and there's no soul there left. But the story I'm learning is that these goddess traditions were the preeminent in like the Ice Age and the Neolithic. And the reason why is that the default social structure for our families is to build our families around the mothers, where you track your family lines through your mother's bloodline, not through your father. And that women would be at the they have marriages, but marriages aren't as like locked down as our marriages, and they're not as monogamous. And so women are not obligated to monogamy. So this is the key thing, is that if you track your bloodlines to the father, which we take for granted in Western culture, then you're obligated to police the women's sex lives. You have to control the women. You have to make sure they're virgins until they're married. You have to make sure that your wives are monogamous to the husband, even though the husband's not monogamous to the wife. This becomes very, very important in a patriarchal culture, that you have to control the women. And we're taught that it's just been like this forever, that men dominate women. And
it's biblical marriage. It's the way it is.
And that this is the way it's always been.
Right.
Well, one of the radical things I've learned is that that's not the way it's always been.
Yeah.
And then, in fact, we know it's not the way it's been because, like, indigenous people to this day still have matriarchal traditions. And academics, again, they hate the word matriarchal because they're like, well, there's no evidence of women dominating men, so therefore there's no matriarchies. That's not how matriarchies work. Matriarchies, they're true. That's true. Women don't dominate men in a matriarchy. Like, they don't physically dominate the men. What it means is the women have independence of the men. The women have their own wealth. They own their property. There's two aspects of it. First of all, is the matriarch, is the bloodlines. But secondly, is that when you get married, the man goes and lives with the woman's family, as opposed to the woman going and lives with the man's family. When the man goes to live with a woman's family, what's called a matrilocal marriage or a bina marriage, and this is going to be critical to the whole Bible story. Trust me, like, this is going to be important because Abraham and Sarah are like this. When the man goes to live with a woman's family, the woman's staying put, right? She stays with her mother, her sisters, her aunties. All the women are staying put. They're raising the children collectively. This is how modern day Native American families are still structured to this day. This is where I learned a lot of it. This is actually how I learned all this stuff from today's Iroquois Haudenosaunee Indians in New York. Like, that's where I'm learning this stuff from. This creates a dynamic where the women have they have independence and authority of their own, and they have authority over broad sectors of life. The men are not emasculated. The women don't want weak men. They still want strong men. And they still have a tribal chief that will go out and lead the war parties and speak for the tribe. The question is, how did that guy get the job? The guy in the matriarchal culture, the women are choosing the man, as opposed to the man just coming in by force and taking the job, or by hereditary. In tribal chiefs and Native Americans, the women, a council of women chooses the man to be their chief. And so the women have all this independence. And if a marriage is unhappy, you kick the guy out and the woman stays put and she's fine. She's not left destitute. Whereas in a patriarchal marriage, if the marriage is unhappy and the woman gets kicked out, she's sunk, right? Like, she's either got babies she can't pay for, or like whatever, she loses the children, what have you. Women are totally disadvantaged in that kind of culture. Well, it turns out that like 80% of human history, I'm not saying patriarchy is a new thing. I'm sure patriarchal tribes have always existed all the way through time. But that something to the effect that 80% is matriarchal. Like, the default condition is always going to be matriarchal because because that's how the women are independent, right?
Yeah.
And this is what we have evidence for of that all of our Neolithic culture. So Neolithic being from the time of agriculture gets invented around 10,000 years ago, up until the beginning of the Bronze Age, which is 5,000 years ago. That whole era is, as far as we can tell, of the whole Near East, is all matriarchal tribes. There's no evidence of kingship. There's no evidence of armies. There's no evidence of slavery. There's no evidence of any of this stuff. All of that stuff comes in the Bronze Age with this technology shift and the introduction of bronze, which changes agriculture towards plow agriculture and changes the nature of work. It also introduces weapons and swords and stuff, and people start riding horses. And this is when we get the time period. So we're talking 4,000 to 3,000 BC, which just so happens to be, again, the biblical date of creation is right at the beginning of patriarchy. Right. It's not a coincidence. Because they're saying this is the only history that matters, is the history of the men. Well, there's this great book. Now I'm going to get it from this book. This is a new history. It's called The Dawn of Everything.
I've heard of that book. Is it good?
Yeah, it's a tome. It's massive, but I cannot recommend it enough. It's amazing. They talk about this quite a bit, that they talk a lot about indigenous democracy and how indigenous people for thousands and thousands of years govern themselves through just democratic processes without any kind of hierarchical leadership. It's not utopia. It's not Shangri-La. It's just a different way of living.
Mm-hmm.
And that people had stable societies for thousands of years. So like specifically in the Middle East and in Mesopotamia, the cities of Uruk, which is where the story begins, people had been living there for like 2,000 or 3,000 years already before the arrival of any kind of kingship, right? Like 3,000 years of just stable indigenous people living there. And they're farmers. They call themselves farmers. And the farmers set up the first towns because they have the first settlements. And they're goddess worshippers. They, they worship nature and the cycle of life, because that's the thing about these mother traditions. They have a common theology. It's all about a circular thinking, a cycle of life, embracing death, ritualizing death so you know how to live, and celebrating the growth of life. That's what these mother traditions are all about. They're all circular, cyclical, nature-based, turning of the seasons, turning of the regenerative life. That's what they're all about. And they are very popular religions, and they're the people's religions. So what happens is with the beginning of the Bronze Age, we start getting all this warfare, and people have to start building walls around their cities. This all happens around like 3,500 BC is when this all begins. And these new emerging class of like warrior leadership sets up shop on the outskirts of these cities initially, but then imposes themselves as a new ruling class, like as a top-down authoritarian ruling class that imposes kingship on top of the indigenous people. And they call themselves the shepherds. Shepherds and farmers become these two different, like Cain and Abel, two different groups of people. And the shepherds are the ruling class, and they're patriarchal. And all the kings of Mesopotamia call themselves shepherd kings. And so the Hyksos, which were probably the descendants of the Hebrews who invaded Egypt, they call themselves the shepherd kings. And this is a term that they use all the way through. And in the early Mesopotamian mythology, you see the shepherd kings ingratiating themselves with the goddesses, ingratiating themselves with Inanna and Ishtar, as they want to like come together. But then later on, when we get to the Hebrew times, which is like 2,000 years later, they're going through this divorce. And the shepherds, who are the Hebrews, call themselves shepherds, they hate the farmers. And they're all throughout the Old Testament, every time they talk about the peoples and the cities and their sex lives, they're always talking about how terrible they are and how they have illegitimate children. They love to say they've got illegitimate children. Why do they have illegitimate children? Because they're not tracking paternity. These are women-dominated cultures, and they've got matriarchal and patriarchal households living side by side in the same towns, because patriarchy starts to impose itself, and it takes a couple thousand years for it to permeate through the whole society. And so, and you see this in the progression of the Mesopotamian mythology as it goes into the biblical mythology. And the feminist historians have long seen this. They've long identified that the goddess is, when you track the goddess portrayals of the goddesses from the oldest traditions to the later traditions, she steadily loses rank, just as women are losing rank in society. And you see in the laws that the women have more property rights in the older laws, and as we go forward in time, they keep losing their property rights until they get all the property rights taken away altogether, which goes hand in hand with the goddesses being knocked off the pedestal. And we see it in the Greek mythology too. The Greeks and the Hebrews are contemporary. And so all the classical Greek mythology of Homer and Hesiod is contemporary with the Old Testament writings. And they're going through the same process where they're overthrowing these tribal matriarchies and imposing male-based kingship and laws, getting rid of tribal justice systems and imposing what we take for granted as law and civilization. And this is, and so all the tribal systems get deemed to be barbarians. We're literally like, they call them barbarians and push them outside the walls of civilization. And it's basically a 2,500 year process that I'm tracking from 3,000 BC, which is the beginning of kingship. That's when the Sumerians have their first kings, when Egypt too is around that same time period, to 500 BC. So 2,500 years. 500 BC is more or less when the Bible's getting written, the Old Testament gets written, and that's the beginning of the Second Temple. And so the First Temple, they were pagans all the way through. They had a mother goddess, and they get rid of her, and they come back in the Second Temple as the Jews, as the monotheistic Jews as we know them. That's Second Temple. But First Temple, it was pagan all the way through. And they're doing all this stuff with sex and drugs. and all these life cycle rituals. So the last point I'll make is that I liken the religion of Asherah, I think, is just one piece of a bigger fabric that the religion of Inanna and Ishtar in Babylon, the cycle of life tradition of Isis and Osiris in Egypt, and the Eleusinian mysteries of Demeter and Persephone in Greece. This is all one big religion of the mother. And it gets chucked out.
Yeah. Dude, that was like a mind blow through history. I feel like there's smoke coming out of my ears because all this stuff is so good, but all this stuff, like you said, is stuff that I was not taught. And you're talking to somebody who went through, 9 years of private Christian school, 4 years of Bible college, upwards of 8 to 9 years of seminary, and a lot of this stuff was never ever even touched on. So to say, yeah, go ahead.
I was just saying, and to be fair, a lot of this stuff was not known. A lot of the best information, is quite new. I mean, the archaeology of the last 50 years has just blown the doors off. So you got to give a little bit of sympathy for people who are just have the old information, because if you go back 200 years ago to when the 1820, when the founding fathers, the last founding fathers were just dying off, they didn't know any of this stuff.
Yeah. But my point in saying that is that for our listeners who maybe have that education piece, there's a lot of stuff in this book and in the things that Ed is sharing with us that we might not have learned in school. But anyway, all that to say, you said earlier, I think before we hit record, that you've been on a lot of podcasts where you've talked to atheists, people who maybe have given up on God and things like that. So here, your platform here is a lot of people believe in God still. They've just abandoned that evangelical understanding that we spoke of earlier. And so all these different things that you just talked about, the matriarchal culture, God having a wife, the mother kind of being taken out of the Trinity. There's no mother in the Trinity, right? There's just Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Cannabis in anointing oil. What are the theological implications of these things? Somebody who's still grappling with what they believe about God. They were raised in a Christian home. Yahweh is very common understanding, Jesus, all these different things. Like, what does all of this have to do to inform what it is that they could believe about God going forward?
Yeah, so I want to start by saying that I deconstructed, but I never became an atheist. And so we've got two competing schools of truth in the Western culture today. We've got religious orthodoxy on one hand, which is the school you were raised in, with all of our all of our traditional beliefs, collectively speaking, in one umbrella of orthodoxy. And then the other competing school of authority is scientific materialism. And science is truth. Now, for the materialist, the whole world is just the material world. There is no spiritual world at all. So they start as a presupposition that there is nothing, that if you can't prove it through material means, then it's an illusion. And there's nothing that exists that's can't be sussed out by material science. But that's a presupposition, right? It's a starting point. And they frame the argument with religious people by saying, well, when you can come with material evidence, then I will agree with you. But you're never going to have material evidence for God because God is fundamentally immaterial. And so they frame the debate this way. And the scientists have been winning this debate for the last 200 years in the court of public opinion. Because religious orthodoxy, their hands are kind of tied because they got to stick with the orthodoxy. You can't stray too far from orthodoxy. You're no longer, you can't go too far into mysticism, or you're no longer Christian. So like the best
That's what I'm told. Yeah.
Well, the best apologists have to thread this needle, because if you stick too hard to literalism, you'll lose the debate every time with an atheist. So a guy like William Lane Craig is pretty artful. He never convinces the atheist, but he's pretty artful about all right, we're not going to be too literal about it, but we're going to stick to the spirit of it all, and actually have. I think William Lane Craig, I don't necessarily agree with him, but he has some pretty reasonable arguments, and he doesn't sound like an idiot. I think William Lane Craig's all right, as apologists go. But those aren't the only two perspectives. And so I'm a very well-educated guy. I spent much of my life in the whole Ivy League, scientific materialist, liberal, secular. That's my background. A liberal, secular guy who didn't really think too much about religion, spirituality. I wasn't an atheist. A part of my story, as I should mention, is that I grew up very exposed to India. So my parents had lived in India before I was born. My father was in the State Department, and they adopted my sister from India. My mother absolutely loved it when she was there. She loves Indian culture. And so I have a sister adopted from Mother Teresa's orphanage. And my mother, when they came back from India, my mother had a retail store where she imported stuff from India. So all when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, my mother had this retail business, and my house was just like full of stuff from India, art and books and tchotchkes, you know? So even though I didn't know anything about the theology or never looked into it or didn't know, I knew there was lots of gods, but I couldn't have told you any of the names or any of them. I was exposed to just the fact that there was this rich culture there, and just the conception that there was another way of looking at things. I knew that much, right?
Yep.
When I went to college, after I deconstructed, I went down the path of comparative religion. So I really like Karen Armstrong, for instance. Have you read her books?
Yeah, I read a little bit of it. Yeah.
She had a huge impact on me because she made the point that depictions of God changes over time, even within a tradition, as people's needs change. Any given depiction of God is going to be a reflection of that culture's outlook and perspective and needs.
Sure.
And so even within Christianity, if you go back 500 years ago, the conversation about God is going to be very different than the conversation we're having today. Likewise, 500 years before that. And if you jump to another tradition, the conversation is very different. But for mystics, this is the other big lesson I learned, was that for mystics, these paths all dovetail. Like, that's what I firmly believe, that if you shed the doctrine and dogma and go the mystical path of trying to find the truth of the divine, that all these traditions ultimately dovetailed. Everyone's searching for the same thing, and nobody's quite getting to the peak, and everyone's climbing the mountain from different sides and got different perspectives. And on this side, the sun might be shining, and it might be hot and burning, and the other side of the mountain, it might be cold, and in a storm, but we're all climbing the same mountain trying to get there. And that all mystical traditions will ultimately dovetail into one ultimate divine truth. That's my conception of the world. And so to the extent that we've got contradictions, it's because people haven't just sussed out the contradictions yet. But if you want to be a mystic, it starts with shedding your doctrine and dogma and keeping what's good. Keep everything that works from it, right? Like, I'm not saying the thing you want to keep is that personal feeling of your connection to the divine. And that comes through Jesus, then that's great. Or if it comes through Krishna, if it comes through whatever, keep that personal feeling of your connection to the divine. And then just trying to be open-minded. So being that I was very exposed to India, also with the cannabis stuff like that, trying to understand the cannabis stuff takes you right back to India, because Shiva is a total stoner, and cannabis is totally sacred in Indian traditions, and it's been there all along. So, like, if you want to understand cannabis spirituality, India is the center of the bullseye. Like, that's where you go. And what do you find in India? Lots of goddesses. So India, like, I don't know how exposed you are to Hindu theology, but it's all mysticism. It starts with mysticism. And so the basic idea of mysticism is that, like, you are God. God is like universal consciousness. God permeates through you. Your consciousness, in what science says is in your brain, but mystics say is outside your brain, is part of the divine, a refraction of the divine, a drawn from the divine somehow. It's part of the piece of the divine. It's I'm not the greatest master at explaining all this stuff, but that spark of a soul within you,
it's oneness, right?
Is oneness with the divine, right? That's the mystical teaching. The Gnostics talk about all this stuff. Every mystical path talks about this stuff. So when people say that there's lots of connections between Gnosticism and like Buddhism, or Gnosticism and Hinduism, they're right, because they're all teaching the same mystical stuff. And so you can be a Christian mystic or a Islamic mystic or a Hindu mystic, and you can come to India and everyone's like getting on the same wavelength. And from the Indian perspective, so in America, we've got this big conflict between Christianity here and science here, and they don't get along with each other. And the Christians don't like the Hindus. They're like, I don't get what you're talking about at all. That's bad. That's like outside my framework.
Demonic.
Demons, bad. Like, I don't even want to understand it. We're just foreclosing the whole conversation.
Right.
Likewise, the scientific materialists have more or less the same opinion. Like, you're just more religious idiots. We already gotten done arguing with the Christians. They've already established that they've got the best religion, and we defeated their religion. So why do I even need to engage?
Right. Why are we even having this conversation? Right.
Like, I'm not going to engage with Indian mysticism any more than I'm going to engage with Christian mysticism. Like, we're going to forget about all of it.
Yeah.
But if you go to India, they're like, we get your monotheism. We have no problem with monotheism whatsoever. Sure, you see lots of gods, but it's actually a polymorphic monotheism. It's one God with infinite manifestations. It's just one God. We have no problem with monotheism. Hindus literally have no problem with monotheism from a theological perspective. They've been debating with Muslims for centuries, right? So they have worked all this theology out, like, deeply, completely. Christians can't deal with it, but the Hindus are like, we have no problem with what you're saying.
Right.
Krishna, Jesus, it's all the same, man. Like, it's all just manifestations of the divine. Likewise, they have no problem with science. They do great science and math in India. They don't have no problem with it. But science, here's the rub. Right now, science claims to have it all sorted out. A guy like Richard Dawkins is up there saying, how can you be so stupid as to believe in God? Science, it's all predeterministic, mechanistic universe. We're sorting out all the equations right now. The stuff we haven't figured out, we'll have it figured out soon enough. We got it all locked down. We know what's going on. The scientists are completely arrogant and completely certain that they got it all sorted out. The thing is, they don't. The materialism isn't totally is also an incomplete and utterly incoherent worldview that, when, in my opinion, turns into politics, has been a disaster every time. When you try to eliminate spirituality from a culture, it is, for the last 200 years, has ended in mass murderous fiascos like the Jacobins and the French Revolution, or the Maoist Cultural Revolution, or all the Stalinist. These were all atheists. All these groups were like, they all share in common that they're going to remove any kind of spirituality, and we're going to have a rationalized, centralized, technocratic utopia that we are going to manufacture through centralized government. It fails every time. It has failed every time. And our current generation of leadership, I believe, is in the process of failing right now. That they're getting stuff wrong all over the place. I work in renewable energy. I can do an entire lecture on why the current policies to electrify everything are going to crash and burn. Even though I'm making my living on deploying solar, I can assure you, like, we're not going to run our civilization on it as much as I'm going to build the heck out of it for the next 20 years. So the materialists, their worldview is incomplete too. They know that they don't have answers for everything. Specifically, what can the physicists not answer? They can't answer randomness. They can't answer dark matter. They claim to have equations that cover all of it, but that includes dark matter, and dark matter is 80% of the equation. It's doesn't sound all that confident to me. They really don't understand quantum mechanics. And this is where they can't square quantum mechanics. And I can't explain quantum mechanics either. So I'm not going to attempt to explain quantum mechanics, except to say that the physicist can't square quantum mechanics with conventional Newtonian, Einsteinian gravity mechanics, because quantum mechanics things are like in two places at once, and there's all sorts of stuff going on that they can't suss out. The other really big problem, they in fact call it the hard problem, is consciousness. They cannot suss out consciousness, and they haven't been able to suss it out for 400 years, because it goes back to the beginning of the Enlightenment when Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. And the logic that the only thing we know for certain at all is that we are conscious, is that we are having an experience right now. That is the only thing you know for certain. You and I right now, our brains might be beakers in a jar being fed electrical stimuli. We might be living a completely hallucinatory experience right now. I might be a madman in a mental institution in a straitjacket, completely drugged up right now, having a complete hallucination that I'm having this conversation. But I know I'm having this experience that I think I'm having the conversation. This was Descartes' big breakthrough, or his I think, therefore I am. That's this profound philosophical, it's a foundation of philosophy. And it's the only thing we know for certain is that we're having an experience. And yet material science can't make heads or tails of it. And Richard Dawkins, as soon as he's done saying, how can you be so dumb as to believe in God? We'll turn around and say, I have no idea about consciousness. I can't make heads or tails of it. I'm completely, after 400 years, the scientists have no idea. But if you go to the East, if you go to Hinduism, they're like, we understand consciousness. We've like, come on in. We've got 5,000 years to tell you all about it. And the guys who did quantum mechanics, the guys who invented it, Schrodinger and Max Planck, these guys were all devotees. Schrodinger in particular says that the Upanishads, which is one of the major sacred texts from India, is describing quantum mechanics, and that his entire inspiration for quantum mechanics came from India. And Max Planck was saying similar stuff. And all these guys that invented quantum mechanics are like, they're spiritualists. They're not materialists. They're spiritualists. But Schrodinger couldn't get anyone to listen to him. And he's like, look over here. This is where the inspiration's coming from. The scientists are all confused. They don't know what to do. And so I feel like we've got two competing schools of truth, and they're both grotesquely flawed, and they're both crumbling. But the religious orthodoxy is on a longer time frame than the materialists, which is like a 200-year time frame, and this is like a 2,000-year time frame. So their arc of history is a little bit longer than these guys' arc of history. But I came across this recent piece of philosophy that's totally blown my mind, and this is actually the biggest thing that's blown my mind recently. The idea is called panpsychism. Have you heard this term?
No.
So Bertrand Russell is a famous philosopher from like a century ago. He wrote a lot about Christianity, atheism. You may have heard of him. He had this idea. He came up with the idea of panpsychism, although it didn't get a lot of attention at the time. And there's a modern philosopher, this guy named Philip Goff, and he's the one writing about it and getting the word out. And Rupert Sheldrake too is another favorite of mine that kind of turned me onto it. The idea is Bertrand Russell took the idea of the hard problem of consciousness and turned it on its head. He said the scientists have been completely unable to figure out how to derive consciousness from matter. Because I was saying, according to scientists, your consciousness is something that exists inside your brain. And it is a product of biological complexity. And that if they just keep poking around in the brain long enough, they're going to figure out one of these days that magic combination of synapses and neurons and biochemistry that gives you consciousness, that it's fundamentally a product of complexity. That's what they say, but they can't prove it. Bertrand Russell said, all right, let's flip the problem on its head. If we can't get consciousness from matter, can we get matter from consciousness? And he said, well, according to the physicists, all of the material universe can be described with physics and math. It's all mathematical, right? Everything reduces to math, and it's the deterministic mathematical equations. Well, math isn't material. Math itself is clearly the product of a mind. Humans didn't invent math. Math was already here. And math is clearly, whatever you say about math, is clearly the product of an intellect. It's clearly the product of a mind. And so based on this bit of logic, the implication is that it's consciousness is the underlying substrate of matter, and that consciousness goes all the way down. And in fact, a lot of the cutting edge of physics right now seems to be pointing in this direction, that they need a new variable in elemental particle physics for free will. That somewhere, it's not that every particle has free will, but there are places in material universe where free will, the divine, that spark, the divine soul, is poking through into the material world, and making choices. It's not to say it's self-aware. It's not to say it has a personality, but it can choose. It can choose between point A and point B. Point A, I'm going to thrive. If I make choice B, I'm going to suffer. So I will choose point A. And that somewhere down at the very bottom of elemental particle physics, these kinds of choices are being made. And that this is how evolution, the structures of evolution are, that there's an engine that drives it, and it's free will. And that it's not just rolling downhill like by gravity. Evolution, there's an element of choices being made, and that's why we get all this crazy diversity of birds and fish and bugs and elements, right? And even like molecules, because like along our history, choices are being made. And so this is called panpsychism, and it's a really emerging field in science, but it's also, or philosophy, but it's really just mysticism, age-old mysticism redressed in a new language. And Philip Goff says clearly he's not a mysticist. He's trying to do this all in terms of science. But he says very clearly that this opens a door to indigenous animism or to mysticism. He's like, I'm not doing that. That's not my path that I'm following, because I'm a scientist. So I'm going to do this all within academia. But like, if you want to say like this is indigenous animism, yes. And that's how I see it. Like that once you recognize that consciousness is pervasive throughout the universe, then it's easy to see God, not necessarily the biblical God, but some kind of God, some kind of ultimate divine. The way I see it is like a source mind, that original source mind. And that there's consciousness takes form all over the place, not just in like the obvious biological life of plants and animals. And I think vegetation is conscious,
Sure.
in the sense that it makes choices. But there's bigger hive structures. There's collective consciousness among human beings. Our societies, our institutions will take on a collective consciousness, and have a mind of their own, right? Like an institution can have a mind of its own. A government. My father talked about this all the time. In bureaucracies, they take a mind of their own. You set
Yeah.
up this bureaucracy to go do something, then it goes and does something else. So if you can see that consciousness is pervasive, it's not hard to rationalize the existence of God in some capacity. And it's not hard to also rationalize Earth Mother as a single biological living organism, which is what indigenous people believe, which is totally what I believe, that literally the planet Earth, Gaia, is a conscious, singular organism. That may seem radical. I mean, it's certainly whackdoodle from a Western perspective, but it's what indigenous people have always taught. It's what Native Americans have always taught. I learned it from Native Americans. And it's not a matter of worshiping it. It's a matter of just recognizing the biological reality that she is a living, breathing creature that deserves to be treated the same as we treat any other creature. We don't beat and punch our mothers and rape our mothers to extract every last resource out of our mother. No, we take care of our mother because our mother loves us and is generous and is going to give us stuff because she loves us and wants us to thrive. So we don't punch our mother in the face to get her to give stuff to us. We ask her kindly and give her a gift, and then she's very generous with us. So that's the way I see it. And then I see that Earth Mother was our oldest religion for our most primitive ancestors when they were first starting to have these conversations of like the existential conversation of where do we come from? What happens to us when we die? What are we doing here? Like what's going on? What are we doing here? Do you know what's going on? Do you? Like, I don't know. Like I do believe that Mother was the first answer. The beginning of these conversations started with Mother. Where do we come from? We came from a mother. What happens to us when we die? We go back to our mother. What do we do while we're here? Whatever our mother tells us. And that over time, and that's what the mythologies tell us, that all of them, from Hesiod's theogony in Greece to the Sumerians, they all start with a divine mother. They don't always call it Mother Earth. They call it the salt waters, and it's in Genesis 1, the waters. Or in India, it's Shakti. Shakti is the primordial chaos, just the raw, unformed energy. It's not even a goddess. It's the raw, unformed totality of all matter and energy. They call it Shakti. And this is one of the oldest parts of Hindu theology, going back to the Rig Veda and before, is Shakti. And one of the principles of Shakti is that all the goddesses are derived from Shakti. So all the goddesses have fungible, and this is explicit in Hindu theology. All the goddesses are fungible with one another. They have a very permeable, and they're all drawn from one, and their identities are quite fluid and fungible. And it's very explicit, and it's particularly explicit with the three goddesses, Parvati, Durga, and Kali. And I don't have my Kali art, but it's coming back. It's getting framed. But those three goddesses directly correlate to the three. There's actually three goddesses in the Old Testament. It's Asherah, Astarte, and Anat. But Anat's not mentioned. Anat is like Kali. Do you know Kali? She's a goddess of death. She's covered in blood. She's got a skull necklace, a belt of human hands. She delights in slaughter, blood, and gore. She has there's a Canaanite equivalent called Anat. And we'll have to talk all about her because she's the most powerful piece on the chessboard. And the biblical writers don't talk about her because they don't even want to give her a name because they're too terrified of her because she's more powerful than El and more powerful than Yahweh, more powerful than Baal. And so they ignore her. I mean, we can go into all the details of the stories, but we're kind of on the. I'd love to do a Bible study with you guys and just go through the stories in detail because there's so much material here that we can't cover it all at once here.
No, I think we definitely have to do a part 2 because we're at the top of our hour, so we're just about out of our time. But this has been mind blowing for me, and I know for our listeners as well. But I think it would be fun to have you back on and talk about how some of this stuff has been taken out of the stories because we've all been taught to read the stories in one particular way, and it's from a very patriarchal view because it's it's Yahweh, it's God as a man, God as a father, and everything else has been stripped away. But I think when you bring this divine mother aspect back into these stories, that was very evident in these cultures, you're going to come away with something very, very different that has huge theological implications. And so I think that you have wet our whistle, as they say, And I hope that people go out and get this book.
I mean, if I could close out with one last comment, it's about,
Yeah.
I really do think that we are in this dangerous moment in human history, or like an inflection point of human history where the old structures are failing and we haven't created new structures yet. And the thing with the mother that gets me so excited is that it's an opportunity to reframe this conversation, and just think about things differently.
Yeah.
And, you know, ultimately, these things take many generations to sort out religious traditions, but like we can have a conversation that hopefully points in the direction of a I think we need a reformation, frankly, and that putting the mother back on the pedestal where she belongs is how we're gonna be integral to sorting out an ecological civilization and sorting out how to make sense of women's independence, how to have a conversation about sex, frankly, sex and death, and just have a different conversation about these things than we've been having.
Yeah.
That I think the mother needs to be back in the Trinity. The mother, father, son, that was the Egyptian Trinity, and of Isis, Osiris, and Horus. And you know, we got to take the hijab off the Virgin Mary and let her shine completely, and let all of her. And that the Shakti principle applies. If you want to know who the mother is, you can take all the god. I apply the Shakti principle to all of them, so that all the goddesses are in fact heavily fluid. And in fact, we see this in ancient mythology that all these goddesses were heavily syncretized with one another. Demeter and Isis and Asherah, they were all heavily syncretized. It's all one big mother. And there's a lot to teach us about circularity and circular thinking that stands in parallel to linear thinking, because that's it is. All the patriarchal stuff is all linear, and the maternal stuff is all circular, and but the linear and circular fit together.
Yeah. So good. Before we go, where can people find you online, interact with you?
I've got a Substack, edwarddodge.substack.com that I every once in a while put something on, and then lostgoddess.io is a website that I've got some stuff on.
Awesome. Well, I'll put the links in the show notes, and we'll do some Bible studies next time.
All right, thanks, Glenn.
Thank you.